Now, part of the reason for this is this book, which is something that Yuri asked me to do because he wanted me to learn how to write on a computer, which I've never done before. So we thought, as we're going to do that, we'll do a bit of research into something interesting. So we started looking at the local dragons, because there are lots of dragon stories in Somerset, and we picked the ones that were nearest by, which is the little village at Alla, and the little village at Dinda, near Wells. And there are some quite well-documented stories of these two dragons. So a great deal of wandering around was done, visiting the sites, looking at the churches and so forth, but we'll come to that later. Let's have a look. Now this is the artwork we did for the cover of the book, and it's a little joke really, because this is the Somerset County Dragon, but we've tweaked it to give some idea of what a dragon is actually about. You'll notice that the foot is rising out of the mists or the waters, which is an important collection we'll go into later. And also that he's upholding the sceptre as if it's the pole star. And you can see below the pole star the plough and so forth. And at the foot of the pole is the tor. Because in the material I was taught when I lived in Essex, a hill like the Tor would be seen as a dragon hill and would be seen as the centre of a ritual landscape. And that was actually why I first came here, to have a look at that hill, having seen a picture of it on, I think, a newspaper of the day, or what. Somebody was talking about the first festival down here, which we weren't interested in at the time. But the photograph of the hill was fascinating, so we thought we must come and see this hill. Let's have a look. Yeah, there we are. And you can see very clearly in this aerial picture the line of the serpent's coils around the hill. Because this type of hill is always thought of as the place where how would you describe it? The serpent of the land itself and the serpent of time starts coiling towards the centre or the timeless axis and then ascends. Let's have a look. So you have the Tor here, and this is Dinda village, where one of the dragon stories is based, and this is Alla, where the other dragon story is based. And much to our amusement, you have a very precise winter solstice sunset and summer solstice sunrise line that runs through all three sites. I mean, that was more incentive to go and find out what was going on here. Now, let me see. Now, this you've heard about from Yuri. This being the dragon parallelogram, basically. You can see there that you've got the Glastonbury zodiac set in the upper half of it. Is an indicator. I mean, yes, it's a working magical tool, the zodiac, and it's a historical thing. It's at least 80 to 100 years old. But there's a lot of evidence in Catherine Maltwood's book that she's pointing towards something. And if you look at the figure of Virgo and where the Tor is, there's a very clear line that passes up through the centre of that zodiac indicating the Tor. He also told you about the Stukely reference that says that the eastern half has the dragons removed and the western half basically doesn't. And this is interesting because if you look around the churches in the western half of this parallelogram, there are dragons everywhere. You know, the most impressive ones are over at Somerton. And Somerton sits right in the centre of the parallelogram. You can see the lion figure, and where the lion's paw is where Somerton actually sits. just there. And if you draw the line down and the line across, the actual crossing is just outside Somerton to the east. Let's have a look. Now this is a little thing that we developed from but you can see the parallelogram there. This is upside down, or north is in the south, north is in the bottom, south is at the top.
Alan, use your red dot
Good point. Yes, there is the south, and there is the north, and this is east, and this is west. So you imagine yourself sitting in Wells somewhere, or further north, and looking southwards. There's the parallelogram, and here is the line we discovered connecting the dragon sites, except that there are slight improvements in detail with this, because the Dinder is on that line, but it doesn't touch where the dragon actually arises. But we'll come into that later. Now this thing on the top here, I think we have a picture of this later and we'll come into it, but this is present in, where are we? Stoke-sub-Hamden Church. There's two churches in Stoke-sub-Hamden. It's a village roughly here. There's the main one in the village, and that just outside the village is a much older 12th century church. And over the northern entrance is this stone tympanum. And this stone tympanum shows the 3 fire signs of the zodiac in a rather interesting relationship, plus a sort of central tree with 3 birds. Now Uri has a theory about the nature of the 3 birds, which is to do with the summer triangle of stars. But my interest was in seeing this as the polar axis, and these signs as a way of orientating a much bigger structure. And this zodiac, which we're sort of putting out there just because the 12th century evidence seems to support it, is based on modern faith. If you read The White Goddess, there's a section in The White Goddess about the way that the Ogham are used by a coven at Wincanton. And he talks about the coven at Wincanton and South Brougham. Where are they? Which are over here somewhere. And says that they are both on the circumference of a 14-mile circle, which is centred on the Tor. And he says that the Tor was the religious centre for the Brythonic peoples of the area when the Normans arrived. But we managed to get hold of the book out of which he got the description of these covens, a thing called Sadducissimus Triumphatus, which is 1600s. There's more detail in the little book over there. And there's no mention of this circle. So we have a feeling that Graves actually got this information from witches he knew. And he talks in one of the essays in his book, The Crane Bag, about Somerset witches that he used to know, and he describes them as considering themselves to be druids and probably founded by 18th century antiquarians in the area. And this is a scenario we've looked at to some extent in our other work entirely in the Maltwood Mood, looking at the history of the Maltwood Zodiac. And there does seem to be some kind of influence of that nature in the area from the big landowners and their esoteric interests. You know, that people were writing on this landscape in esoteric ways long before the Glastonbury Zodiac. So that's very much a work in progress. But for the fun of it, we said, you know, if this circle is real, it's that big, it includes the area covered by that map that goes all the way up to sort of Stanton Drew Stones and right down to Ham Hill. And that's Burnham area that side. This goes past Wincanton to Stourhead. So it's a huge area. And it's orientated according to the signs on that tympanum, which sit at its southern point. And that gives you a zodiac based in that. So that it's Pisces at the bottom, and it's Virgo at the top. And the west side is Gemini, and this side is Sagittarius. But, you know, the only information in this tympanum. But we're leaving it here and see if it develops something interesting. Now, what's next? Yeah, this is the actual tympanum itself, which is tantalising because... No, I'm doing this wrong. That's it. In this area you can actually read the word Sagittarius, but all the rest is worn out. And there's a vague hint here of an E and an O and possibly an L, which gives you Leo, hence this, which looks more like a dog really. But you've got up here the Agnus Dei for the Aries lamb, and here a nice Norman centaur with his Norman helmet and so forth. Let me see. Yes, and this is the dragon slaying right beside that tympanum on the outside wall. So this is also facing north. And it's interesting because this chap is on the west, and this dragon will be standing in the east, which of course is where all the dragons were slain in the Stukely story. But it's just a little tiny entry window. Here is the small window. The door is up here. A big porch, and inside the porch is the tympanum. It's quite hidden. This is from the top of that scarp, just above the village of Allah, looking sort of southwest towards the church. And this is the church hiding among the trees. But the church area is where the original settlement of Allah was. It was a little higher piece of land sitting among the swamps. And as such, it was very well defended. But after the Normans had arrived and set up the abbey, the monks decided they wanted to drain the area and straighten the River Parrot, improve the flow, and the swamps disappeared. So all their defences vanished as well. So they had to move the village along this little road. And to the slope, you can't see them now because it's beneath the vegetation, but it's beneath there. Where am I? Now this is looking the other way. This is looking from the church towards that scarp. And it's almost impossible to see from here, but somewhere in this area is an area of very sparse vegetation. It looks as though it's been burnt over by a sort of grass fire. And this features in the story of the dragon. Because now I should tell you the local dragon story at this point, because the Allah dragon is supposed to have appeared either from the Curry Rival Hills, which are the other side of the valley, or to have had a nest at the top of that scarp, depending on the story you hear. And of course it did the standard thing of terrorising the locals and eating cattle for quite some time, and nobody could do anything about it until a local guy called John of Allah, surprisingly enough, decided to deal with it. And he dressed himself up in a coat covered in pitch and put a breathing mask on and challenged the dragon. And in one version of the story he kills it and that's it. In the other version of the story it kills him, but it dies in the same process. In the first version of the story he finds its nest in a cave at the top of that hill and kills all its chicks and buries the cave, which is why you can't find the cave up there anymore, of course. But the interesting point there is that the dragon is obviously female if it has chicks, and this becomes important later. And also it's associated with a frequently flooded area where there was a lot of anxiety over what the river was going to do. The third point that comes up here is that the chap who slays it is Norman. He's either a Norman peasant or a Norman landowner, and the evidence tends to favour him being a Norman landowner. Let's have a look. Yes, because this is supposed to be his effigy. It's not a particularly impressive piece of sculpture, but it's been weathered outside for many, perhaps hundreds of years. And there was another smaller chapel on the island, where the big house on the island is now, rather than where the church is. And it was supposed to be an effigy that was in that chapel, because John of Allah is an actual sort of landowner for the area for about 1250, who put this chapel together, and he's supposed to be buried in it. And this, they think, is his effigy. And if you go to Allah Church, enter the main doorway and look to your right, it's against the wall in the corner. It's not particularly obvious. This is a nice little feature inside that church. It's sort of opposite the entrance. There's a small window where they've rescued a Norman window heading, which is a nice little double-headed dragon with a bit of number symbolism in the middle of the 7 dots and so forth. And of course beneath it you have St. Michael the Dragon Slayer, set in the same little window opening. And my favourite thing there is, this is the entry gate to the church. You can just see the church in the background, sort of there. But right round the side of the gate, as you get out of your car, you have this little chap, who is obviously the work of the local potter, because the village itself is very into its dragons. It has bonfire festivals and various bits of sculpture around the village. Let's have a look. Yes, that's it. Now this is the actual Allah Dragon mosaic, which is, as you can see on the village hall, that's off the main road as you enter the village. And it's a massive great plaque made out of broken pottery. There's another similar thing on one of the other buildings in town, but that's nothing to do with dragons. And here you have your local hero going for the dragon's heart. But that basically is the Allah dragon. That was the first one we looked at. Now this is the other way. This is going past the Tor, heading towards Dinder. And when you go past Glastonbury, you get to the Heart Lake area that Yuri mentioned, where the two rivers meet. This is all floodplain. On the other side of it, there are the hills where you have North Wootton and where the Little Red Lake River arises. And one of these hills is Worminster Slight. This is where the dragon is supposed to have actually originated from. And as you can see, it's muddy, and the earth is quite red. You get red earth deposits in this area underlying white lias, which are quite interesting. And back home in Essex, at earth like this, red earth was considered to be a sacred area of land. And I don't know if that custom holds here, but I think it probably does. You see up here, this is the actual peak, and there's a blockhouse which we think is probably a water tank, but we're not sure. And on top of it is a big wooden cross. And I've found that it's not an uncommon custom here for people to put crosses on significant hilltops, and I'm not sure whether it's just a a village Easter celebration or whether it's actually trying to keep the things under control. But there's a wonderful view from the top of this hill. So you can see most of the villages that the dragon is supposed to have terrorised, the one that arose here. And it's supposed to have attacked North Wootton, Dulcut, Dinder and Crosscombe, and they form an arc of villages, sort of south to sort of north, but round the west of this hill. Now, this is a view from the top. As you can see, it was a wonderfully misty day when we climbed it, but that there is the Tor, and this is the valley of the little Red Lake River heading towards the Tor into the Heart Lake Moor. And this here is what the locals call Dragon Hill. And the actual line from Allah through the Tor crosses Dragon Hill somewhere here and then carries on up to Dinder. And it carries on past Dinder up into the Mendip Hills to a very well preserved hill fort at Maysbury, or Masbury, I'm not sure what the local pronunciation is, but we had to go and have a look at that. And sadly I haven't got the view from there, but there's a wonderful view across the whole system right to the Tor and down to the hills where Somerton is. And it's a hill fort well worth visiting if you can find it. You sort of have to head for Crosscombe and miss and climb the hills behind the garden centre type thing. Now what have we here? Now this is the only meaningful picture of Dinder Church, because Dinder is right steep in the valley. You can't see it from Worminster Slight, but it's over the hilltop and in the steep little valley of the River Sheppey with woods either side. And it's an estate village. There's a big house that seems to have been owned by the Somerville family, and the church is almost in the grounds of the house. And the back door of the church, the southern door, has a little niche over it, and this little chap is in the niche. And he's quite an intriguing mixture. I don't know how old he is, but you've got wings, so he's obviously an angel, but you've got a nice medieval or pre-medieval helmet. And he's attacking a dragon that has certain resemblance to a horse. But it's interesting that he's placed there. He's looking to where the dragon site would be. Where are we? Now that's another dragon in the actual village, because the village is only a little sort of H shape of houses and streets, nothing much there. But as it was an estate village, it didn't have all the normal facilities, just houses for the workers in the estate. And one of the houses was turned into a local equivalent of a pub. And this was the sign for the pub. As you can see, what you've actually got is a wyvern, two limbs and two wings, and a good coiled tail. But you've got a 12-spoked wheel. And this is actually the arms of the Somerville family. But we quite like the idea that this might represent another zodiacal hint. It fell apart slightly because in the church there's another version of this which only has 8 spokes. So obviously they weren't too keen on consistency, but let's have a look. Now this is a record of the story in a mosaic near the Bishop's Palace in Wells. And the reason for that you'll get from the story itself, because again you have a dragon arises in the 1200s and terrorises the villagers around Worminster Slide, which we've seen. And the people come and complain to the local bishop, who is Bishop Jocelyn of Bath and Wells at that time. And he says he'll do something about it, so he gets all his men of arms together and he heads off towards Dinder. And when he's a furlong away from the dragon, he decides he's not going to harm any more of his men, so he, by himself, he heads off in armour on his horse and fights the dragon and kills it. And when he comes back to his men, he's bearing a head. And one version of the story I've read says that the head was a woman's head, which is the dragon's head. Another that it was a human head. It varied. As with all these stories, you get different versions from different places. But there is a sort of 13th century written version of this one. I'm trying to remember, I've forgotten the name of the guy who did it, but there was an actual document written by monks at the period which was kept. I think it ended up at the College of Eton. So there is a record of the story from more or less the period in which it's set, which is unlike the other one, which is more random. But you get all around here, you get the various bits of the story. But an important part of this one was that in order to keep the dragon away, there had to be a reenactment of the slaying every 50 years. And this is supposed to have been carried on ever since the 1200s, according to the story. I have my doubts about that, but apparently they had the last one was in 2001, and they missed it slightly, and they would have missed it completely, except that some local lass at Dinda remembered that it had to be done and told the bishop. And the rule was that the dragon had to be slain by a left-handed man of the cloth, which immediately made me think, because in sort of old magical lore there's a thing about the left and the right hand, and it's not left is bad and right is good. It's to do with the right hand represents doing normal religious activity to bring in whatever presence you're wishing to talk to, and the left hand is in harnessing the power of that presence for your own purposes, as in making a magical charm or putting the power of a saint in a talisman or something like that. So what they're saying effectively is that you need a magically trained cleric in order to put the dragon down, which we thought was quite fascinating. And that this idea of a ritual that follows on from the event, or in some way harnesses it, you have remnants of it at Allah. This is what I forgot to mention, but the spear that John of Allah used to slay the dragon at Allah still exists. And it's quite an unusual thing. It's sort of 9 or 10 foot long, and spearhead, wooden spear, with a leather coating on it, with different coloured sections. And it used to hang in the church tower at Allah, upright as a sort of polar axis type feeling. But later on it was taken out of there, and it's now in a little chapel nearby. Given that they probably still use it for something, I won't say where it is. Now this is a complete change of tack, as you may notice. Because we were thinking about, why do you get this complex of ideas about dragons? They're female, there's water involved, there's obviously the blood of the slaying, this kind of thing, and there's serpents. And I was talking about this with my wife, and she said, well, I've got a book here you should read. And she gave, this is a blatant advert for someone else's book, she gave me a book called Blood, Bread and Roses by Judy Grant, which is, I'm not entirely certain of the age of it, it's 1980s, perhaps 1990s. And Judy Grant is a sort of American feminist academic. And she's done a lot of work into the idea that the menstrual cycle was what forced human awareness to develop, and that it developed first obviously in women who have the menstrual cycle. And all of the different aspects of that cycle pertain to ways in which human awareness can be made self-aware. One of these things is that if you're living in a group of people out in the wilds where you're under natural light, this kind of cycle tends to adjust to the moon's cycle, because the bright light causes ovulation. And of course, halfway around from ovulation, you have menses itself. The other aspect of it is that obviously there are mood changes and changes in mode of awareness. And one of those changes is that you become more amenable to the other world being able to talk to you. So basically, from that viewpoint, women were the first people who contacted the other levels or other realities. The men didn't have that ability at that point. And the other one is the serpent, because the serpent was the ideal image for obviously the blood flow, and there are other phenomena to do with the blood flow that she said are serpentine. And you got the motion of the serpent, which is fluid, etc., etc., etc. And the way a serpent eats is to sort of swallow and surround things. If you've ever seen a snake eating a rat, it's quite impressive to watch. But that was another link to the function of the vagina, etc., etc. But basically it's the beginning of metaphor, where you have a thing outside of you that represents something that's going on inside you. And this was a complex of ideas that is very, very early, and if the woman is right, it's part of the fundamental consciousness of being human. So men will have it as well, but they access it later. Let's have a look. Yes, this is the nearest we could find to a sensible graphic about the changes of mood. It uses the Wiccan thing about maiden, mother, crone and so forth. But there's tons and tons of this material on the internet, not all of which is very helpful. But that does at least give you some hint as to mood changes through the cycle. I don't know if you can read any of that, because I can't make sense of it properly from here, but I'm sure a copy of it could be found somewhere. But the basic thing is that you have, at the period before menses and during, you have this access to the other world consciousness. And that becomes a very important factor in this. The other one is, I'll probably best mention it now, the idea that the mood build-up is to do with the Earth's dragon energy building up in the body, which is then released. You know, obviously if there's no pregnancy, the egg continues and is released, and the dragon energy follows it, because the dragon energy is to do with basically life energy, and if it's not required, it's passed on. Yeah, this is the idea of the moon. This is in the same orientation with the moon phases. And left in nature, apparently, this is where ovulation occurs, full moon, and this is where menses occur, this sort of period. And for those who are interested in mythology, it's very interesting to look at the mythology of Hecate in this context, but I'll leave you to speculate on that. But this idea, we'll develop this first, I think, is once you've got this synchronization with the moon, then you have an awareness of things outside you of which you're a part. And also, in studying the moon, you tend to notice things like the sky and the stars. This is the second part of the moon. You know, this is actually an Orphic world egg, but you'll see why. The second part of the moon is that if you're in a group where everybody is synchronized as one, they're all in tune with the moon, so to speak, then they can share mood and they can share awareness. And the sharing of awareness in this way in the inner world makes a collective mind in the inner world, which you can access, which they call an egregore. And this collective mind becomes far more than the sum of its members, and is able to hold wisdom for them and give wisdom to other people, connect people together, etc., etc. And it's also, being as it is actually constructed in the other world of imagery, it's accessible to beings in the other world who can approach it from their dimensions. So it acts as a sort of an embassy between our awareness and other awareness. So this just really represents that egregore. And because of the image of the serpent swallowing everything, that became the image that was used to represent this egregore. And it represents the sort of collective of menstruating women. And of course, once this egregore has been constructed in the other world, then the key images that give you access to it are not restrained to women. They can be given to men. So anything that will cause the right kind of mood and the right kind of visualizations will open the door to that egregore. Now, where are we? Oh, this is mainly a reminder to me that there are three facets to it. But this is I'm not even sure what they call these things, but they've found loads of these in Scotland. They're, if you like, they're sort of serpent's eggs that have been tweaked to give deeper meaning. They've sort of very hard granite and so forth like that, and they fit into the sort of palm of the hand. And they're very old, you know, they're thousands of years old. And they're all made to the proportions of the Platonic Solids. If you know of the Platonic Solids, you know, there's only 5 possible ones where you have equal length lines in a sphere. And each one was assigned an element. And this one is a tetrahedron. There's 4 of these knobs, which means it assigns to fire. But that's not quite relevant to what I'm talking about. The only reason I put it in there really is that it is a serpent's egg symbolically, and it has 3 lobes. And one lobe is the ancestor contact we've talked about, because the ancestors live in this egregore as well as the living, because all mind ends up in there. And this is the lunar connection to it, and this is the water or serpent connection to it, because as the metaform develops, the serpent becomes all fluid, sinuous movements. It can be the physical waters, it can be the dragon lines in the earth, whichever, doesn't matter. Now this is a bit of fun, but this is a modern rendering of the medieval Lilith. Because you can see I'll come into this a lot later, but they tended in the medieval period to portray the serpent in the Garden of Eden as a version of Lilith, and what they drew as Lilith is this sort of dragon-tailed female figure. But I'm cheating here and using her as an early version of Tiamat, if anyone's heard of Tiamat. Because once you understand the moon's cycle and you understand the connection of that with mind, then the cycle of the moon, the phases of the moon, which this is previously about, can be assigned to different aspects of consciousness. So you can have a wheel of mental states numbered around the days of the moon. So you have a 29-day cycle, and all around those days you can have different mind states mapped out. And this sort of system probably existed for a good length of time, but it's a good way of remembering the pattern. But later on, as you observe the moon in the night, you'll notice that it sits at different places among the stars. And the more observant people will then have noticed, first, that the movement of the moon among the stars is only 27 days. It takes 27 days to move from one star round and back to the same place. And also that this mirrors the motion of the sun in the year. So the moon's mental states and powers can be used to map the year. And given that you're dealing with sort of wild humans at this time, the images used for these mental states are trees, plants, animals, fish. You know, there are no buildings, there's nothing else around. So here is your zodiac, basically. So the first zodiac is lunar. But later on, as the sort of male entry into this egregore develops, you get dear Marduk here finishing off Tiamat and using her body to rebuild a new way of looking at the world, and the thing becomes more masculine, for want of a better word. But there's partly this is the reuse of this egregore, and partly it is about 3000 BC. The zodiac that was used before that was ceasing to be of any use to anybody because of precession. And the Babylonians used this myth to formally reorder their zodiac. There's quite a lot of documentary structure about this. And Yuri's told me I haven't got much time left, so I'll see what I can do. Now, one of the children of Tiamat, one of her scarier ones, is Hydra, which is below the sun's path, under Leo. And Hydra was considered the sort of serpent of poison and blight, because the stars of Hydra rose at that time when it was the hottest weather and there was no food about and no water and everybody was dying of drought and so forth. So it was considered a bad omen. Now this I've put in basically to remind myself of the idea that the above reflects the below. In this case, the bowl can represent the land or the waters in the land, or it can represent your body and the waters in your body. But both of them reflect the stars above. And there's the pole star and Ursa Major and so forth. We put the Tor in for good measure. But the bowl of water has been a scrying tool forever. And we were taught about that in Essex on how to use that kind of thing. This is a little explanation of the dragon hill. Because if you think of Hydra as sitting on the path of the sun, this could be seen as the serpent of the path of the sun. And this is your normal awareness and your range of moods. The trick in spiritual work is to take that outer path and move it to the axis where everything's timeless. And this is where all collective consciousness sits, but in a timeless state. So the circle has to be cut and the serpent led to the middle, and you find the middle by balancing polarities across the circle, which is why the opposites of all the zodiac signs are really important. And this is that little doodle that was used last time that basically shows Hydra as this is the rim serpent, the world that you can become attached to, and if you become attached to it, you're trapped. Or you can look up from Leo and there's Ursa Major, there's Draco sitting around the pole. That's the ecliptic pole, not the pole the sky turns around. And these are the four royal stars. That's Regulus. That should be Aldebaran in Taurus. That should be Fomalhaut in Aquarius. That should be Antares in Scorpio. And any resemblance to the crucifixion is quite deliberate. Because it's actually mentioned in the Bible. Jesus identifies himself with the upraised serpent in the desert, which is this figure. Now this you've seen before. This is the Bianchini Tablet. So you've got the decans, the planets that rule them, 2 zodiacs because it was for working out synastry for lovers. So you put 2 horoscopes on it. And these are what they call the Paranatalonta, the signs that rise with the zodiac signs that went out of fashion a long time ago. And these are the 2 bears. But the head of this being is very interesting. It's a serpent, and it's the military Draco they used to use, as Yuri and so on described. But it has a head which is made of a dog's head and a cockerel's head, which goes back to very, very old material about good and evil being symbolised by those 2 images. There's another version of the image with some military Dracos for decor. and a man carrying one. Right, how long have I got?
You're out of time.
Damn. Oh well.
Another couple of minutes.
Well, the important.
2 minutes.
Yeah. This is important. This bit. These are river serpents, and Yuri knows where this came from. It's an old 1600s, 1700s book.
It's on Polyolbion.
Ah, yeah. So
The Isle of Babylon.
yes, and all these river serpents represent little river basins. And going back to this idea of the egregore, you have the collective mind. It breaks down into lots of areas which have the right symbolism. And each river basin has a river, a source, so it's a nice water serpent there. And each water serpent looks after a different group of people, a little tribe. And here's a Roman equivalent of this. You have this is a little household shrine. Every house would have had something like this. And here is the serpent from the underworld, the ancestor serpent who brings all the life and fertility, coming up to receive his presents from the priest of the household at the little polar altar. And here's Melusine, who is a medieval equivalent of the river serpent who looks after sovereignty of an area. You'll have to read up the story of Melusine. I won't have time. We'll leave this chap out. He's more to do with what happens when you move from the circle to the pole. Now these are the dragons at Somerton, right in the middle of that dragon parallelogram. These are the dragons within the roof space at Somerton Church. They're not ancient particularly, but they are very appropriate in the middle of that dragon parallelogram. And it's a little church well worth seeing. And here's Lilith in the tree again, being the serpent, which is quite a curious one because she's got chicken legs as well as human torso and so on. And there's another slightly better version of it. But these are the sort of things that exist within the dragon slaying stories. You can see all of these archetypes there. And this is just a little thing about that inner egregore making itself apparent if you know how to look. These are all little pictures from the book. And this is the book we did, which you can get over in the corner there. Blatant advert. But there's more in the book, there's a proper bibliography, there's more detail. But I've gone into some of the little oddities that keep coming up in this story. Right,
Thank you very
I think
much.
we'll give up at that point. Right, we'll do that.